Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. And I'm recording today from Lisbon, Portugal. This week's Casual Friday podcast is going to consist of tidbits. Some of these I pre-recorded when I was back in Minneapolis before we left on our trip, and some of them I'm recording today. So let's get started. I've mentioned Fassett a few times in the past month. He's an artist who got into knitting in the 1970s and fell in love with color in textiles. Some of the very first knitting books I bought were by Fassett. His glorious knits book as well as family album. So I've always loved his use of color. So he still knits, but he has delved into various other textile crafts like quilting and designing quilting fabrics. So I'm getting ready to go on a trip, and the first thing I do is make a packing list and think about what knitting I'm going to take along. And so usually I like to knit a sock, start knitting a sock either in the waiting area before boarding or once we get on the plane. So I was looking through my sock yarn, and I saw this ball of Regia yarn, and it's one of the Regia design line yarns, and the colorway was designed by Fassett. So I've had this love for all his use of color for literally decades. I bring this up because this first tidbit is from Bernadette, who sent it to me on Ravelry, and it's an article that appeared in the Guardian's Life and Style section back on October 8th. And it's about Kaffe and his life as a textile artist. And you get to see what he's done within his house with his use of color. So I'm gonna leave the link down below in the show notes. The second tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed from an account devoted to women artists. Now, the post had a photo of some really interesting knitted artwork by an artist named Tatyana Yanishevsky. But one of the things that really irks me about these types of Twitter accounts is that they never provide a link to the source where they took the image or provide information on where to learn more. So once I saw one piece of Tatyana's work, I needed to see more. So of course, I Googled around and then I found her website. So the information on her website says that she is an artist and technologist living in Providence, Rhode Island. So her practice includes knitting, building structures out of steel, sewing and embroidering, making rubber molds, casting resin, and building circuits. So she sounds like a really interesting artist. So if you go to her website and you click on the info tab, you can read more about Tatyana as well as find links to the various articles that have been written about her work. And if you want to see the works made with knitting, click on the tab at the top that says the Knit Garden. This tidbit came to me a few weeks ago from Susanna. In her note, she referred to a Casual Friday episode from earlier this summer where I mentioned that I just love going to like the state fair and seeing all of the creative activities. I like going to wool festivals and seeing demonstrations. And just in general, I love seeing what sorts of creative activities people are up to. And at the time, I said that I would love to see what sorts of events like this there might be in other countries. So Susanna sent a link to a video about a sew and knit event that goes on in Sweden every year, which I'll link to down below. But she also sent a second link to a Sami woman talking about knitting and sewing their traditional clothing. So I think you'll find both of those really interesting. This tidbit came from Daniel, who says, "Hope this finds you well. Stumbled upon this, thought of the tidbits section. The animation is done with knitted fabric and felted yarn." So the link he sent is to the official video for a song by musician Frankie Cosmos. The animation is pretty cool. The background looks like squares of a knitted afghan, and then different scenes are felted onto, like needle felted onto the squares, but they're not felted completely solidly down. It allows some of the wool to be moved to create the animation, so it might look like things like fingers on a keyboard or something like that. Because this was a music video on the musician's channel and not a channel of the textile artist, I looked to see if I could find out more about who the animator was, and I checked the video description. So the person's Instagram account is called Coach Loves You, and there are so many cool wool-based animations to see there. I will leave links, of course, down in the description to both the Instagram account as well as the music video. I didn't write down where I got this tidbit from. I possibly saw this on Instagram or maybe on Twitter. I'm really not sure. But it's an event in Toronto at the, I think it's BATA or BATA, it's B-A-T-A, the BATA Shoe Museum on November 8th. And it sounds so cool. I wish I lived in Toronto so that I could see it. The event is Forensic Fashion, investigating old clothes from the rag trade to the lab, presented by Amber Butchart. So I've spoken about Amber previously in Tidbits. She hosted a show a few years back called A Stitch in Time, which recreated clothing items, like historic clothing items that had been featured in works of art. So really famous paintings or statues, whatever, they were recreating the clothing in order to understand what that clothing would have been like and what it would feel like to have worn this clothing. So I first heard of Amber from a newspaper article I saw that said that she worked with police on homicide investigations when bodies were discovered decades after they had been murdered. So what she would do is go in and like look at their underwear, and then she would be able to pinpoint within a few years when that person would have died. From there, I found out more and more about her, and I follow her on Instagram. That may be where I saw it, was on her Instagram account. But anyway, if you live in or near Toronto, you might be interested in the event. The description is, join the BSM as we welcome renowned fashion historian, curator, and forensic garment analyst Amber Butchart as our 2022 Founders Lecturer, who will discuss her work in forensic garment analysis. In this illustrated talk, she considers the power of old clothes in storytelling across literature and myth, the global problems inherent in our discarded old clothing, and the potential of fashion as a tool for forensic science. A Q&A and reception will follow the conversation. Guests will also have the opportunity to view the BSM galleries, including our upcoming exhibition, Obsessed: How Shoes Became Objects of Desire, that opens to the public on October 19th, 2022. So this event on November 8th will be from 7 to 10 p.m. and the price of admission includes a reception afterwards. So I'm going to leave links to all of this information down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me in the form of two different articles sent to me by two different people, Kristen and Claudia. The first article appears to have been written by someone who read the second article. It's much briefer, and it was clear that they didn't quite understand some of the textile terms. They misused a few textile terms, but it does give an overview of the topic if you want to get a quick feel for what it is. The second article was published in Scientific American, and it thoroughly discusses the topic, which was a type of fabric that Viking women wove for, I don't know, 5 or 6 centuries, from about the mid-900s on. And it was considered incredibly valuable. In fact, it was considered to be currency. It was called legal cloth. So this type of use of textiles as money apparently has occurred in various places in the world at different times when other sources of currency weren't really available or easily made, for example. The article talks first about how understudied textiles have been in archaeology, and which is true for a couple of reasons. One is textiles deteriorate, so they just don't last and they aren't available to study. So it's not like tools or weapons which will last for literally millennia. But also because archaeology had been dominated by men who viewed the things that they found through their modern lens and biases, oftentimes they just judged things as not being worth studying. And textiles is one of those things. So there was an example a few years ago of a body being found that had been buried with a lot of weapons, indicating that the person was a warrior, and they assumed that it was a man. But then once DNA testing was done, it was shown that this was actually a woman. And so their preconceived ideas about what a warrior was or who a warrior could be was incorrect. And this has shown to be true with their attitude about textiles as well. So just to give you a taste of the Scientific American article, one of the paragraphs says, regular modern cloth, here Smith explains, could vary from 75 to 30 warp threads. But in Iceland, and only in Iceland, from the 12th through the 17th century, every textile from every site fell into a tight range of 4 to 15 warp threads. In addition, the spin direction of the yarn clockwise, which is also called Z-spun, versus counterclockwise, known as S-spun, shifted almost completely from Z-spun warp and weft to S-spun in the weft in the 11th century. So all of these details are specifications for legal cloth. And then there's a word for it in Icelandic, which I will put on the screen, and I have no hope of pronouncing this. So women were literally making the money. So I would encourage you to read these articles. It's just so fascinating from both a historical standpoint and a textile standpoint. And again, I will leave links down below. I'm also going to include an article that I found from a web page that talks about legal cloth in slightly more general terms, but also has a video, a YouTube video embedded in it that goes into some explanation as well. This tidbit came to me from Maya on Ravelry. She sent me a link to a Tumblr post about a fat-tailed sheep. And I have to admit that when I was reading this Tumblr post, I was a little skeptical that this could be a real thing. I did some more reading, and sure enough, it is real. So we all understand that camels, which live in the desert, store their fat in a hump on their back. And the reason for this is that if the fat was stored throughout their body, it would cause them to be overheated. So the fat-tailed sheep are in a similar situation. So their fat storage is in the rear end and in their tails. So this can create tails sometimes that are extremely heavy. And in fact, there are even pictures of these sheep that are hooked up to carts where the cart is supporting the tail. So the fat that comes from the sheep is what is so highly prized. The wool is not that great. It's mostly used in textiles like wool rug making, that kind of thing. But the fat was really prized as a really good source for cooking, and that was what it was mostly raised for, and is what it's mostly used for today. But I'm going to leave some links down in the show notes to the original Tumblr post that Maya sent me, as well as to some other articles that I have found as well. This tidbit came to me from my Twitter feed. I follow a fashion or a dress historian called Alden Brown. She's on the East Coast of the US here. And she posted a photograph of a scrapbook that is in the collections of the Winterthur Museum, and apparently it was their dress diary of the day post in some place. I couldn't figure out where it was originally posted. It could be an email newsletter, But the photograph is from a scrapbook that was created by a woman named Florence, I believe her name is Walden. And it was a scrapbook of the dresses that she made for her daughter Louise. So each page is devoted to a certain year, like when she was 2 years old or 3 years old. And you'll see little pictures of the dresses that she made. These might be from pattern, like images from the actual pattern packet. And then included in there were little scraps of the fabrics that were used for the dresses, and sometimes little bits of the trim as well. And it's a fascinating piece of work. I wanted to find out more about this scrapbook, so I did find it listed in their library catalog in the Winterthur Museum, so you can read more about Florence and her daughter and a little bit more about the size of the scrapbook, but no more images. I couldn't find any other images. But the one image that Alden posted is really enticing. This tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed. It's an extremely rare book that was created in 1889. Here is the description of this book so that you can understand it, because when you see the photograph, you can't really understand what you're looking at. This unorthodox book of prayers is entirely machine woven of gray and black silk. Faced with coming up with a submission for the World's Fair of 1889, artisans in the textile capital of Lyon programmed Jacquard looms with hundreds of punch cards. So difficult was the project that this is the only woven book ever produced. The woven book nevertheless won a grand prize, and it is now renowned as a prototype for the computer. Woven in Lyon, perhaps passing through the Parisian agent J. Kaufman, this is one of between 50 or 60 books printed with silver and black thread on silk looms that were programmed using the punch card system developed by Joseph Marie Jacquard. It was displayed in 1889 in the Lyon Pavilion at the Universal Exposition, featured by the firm J.A. Henry, whose textiles were highly reputed. The firm won a Grand Prix at the 1889 exposition. I'll leave links where you can actually see the complete book, and it allows you to zoom in really closely so you can see all of the really fine detail. It's an amazing accomplishment to have made a book that was completely woven and not printed with ink on paper. This last tidbit came to me from Stacy on Ravelry. It's a Shaker Hat knit-along that starts Sunday, October 23rd. It's free to register for it, but you need to register by October 23rd or you can't participate. So once you register, you will be sent the pattern and the agenda for the knit-along. Now I've registered for it, but I'm here in Europe and I registered for it early this morning, so I expect that it'll be later in the day when they wake up in the US that I will be sent the pattern. My understanding is that there will be 3 one-hour Zoom meetings, one on October 23rd and then one in November and one in December. I'm not really sure how it's going to be structured and how the whole thing will work out, but the hat has a fascinating story behind it. So this is a hat that was created by a Shaker woman, and if you're not familiar with what the Shakers were, there is one Shaker community that still exists in the US, but it's very small. It was became popular in the late 1700s, and it was an egalitarian community, religious community that survived based on recruiting new members, because once you became a member, you were celibate. So they weren't producing their own little Shakers. They had to be brought into the community. Sometimes they adopted orphans or things like that, but the membership relied on recruitment. They're renowned for their designs, like furniture and other sorts of designs that were simple but really elegant and really well made. This hat was donated to the Shaker Museum that is doing this knit along. It was purchased in the early 1900s by a man And he wore it for decades and then decided to donate it to the museum because he was pretty sure they wouldn't have had another example like this. So the fiber is a blend of raccoon and silk, so very, very warm. And I'll leave links down below. There's a couple of articles about the women who sort of figured out this raccoon silk blend, and originally were hand spinning it, and then they got mills to card the fiber for them, and then they found a mill eventually that could spin it into yarn so they wouldn't have to do all of that labor in order to create the little knitted accessories. So there's a little funny knob on the front here. It's like a knitted button. So there's a buttonhole in the doubled back ribbing, and then that knitted button keeps that in place. What fascinates me about this hat is the brim that goes under it too, which could be really an interesting add-on to a hat in the winter to keep the sun off, as well as keeping your head warm. So I've signed up for it. I'm really interested to see the pattern, and if you can do so by October 23rd, you can get a copy of the pattern as well. And again, I'll leave links to different articles down in the show notes about the women that were spinning this yarn, as well as links to photographs of the different items that they were making at the end of the 19th century or into the early 20th century. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday, coming to you from Lisbon. And I will see you next week when I am back in Minnesota. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions for videos you'd like to see, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.